thank you for inviting me, for giving the opportunity here to present also the work of the group of chief science advisors to the Commission, and to reflect on some perspectives on science and politics that interchange or exchange and challenges in this relationship between science, policies, politics, and the public. We heard a few keywords, and one of the key keywords is actually trust. So trust is the basis for society to function. There's no doubt about it. Relationships are built on trust, and when we feel unwell, we seek, for example, the help of a medical doctor, and we need to trust that person to give us good advice on how we may feel better. Research, of course, is based on trust and trusting data that we have obtained, our own data, or maybe data that's been presented by colleagues. For example, also data on science communication research. We just heard a wonderful talk. And trust is crucial when it comes to science advice too, no doubt. Science advisors, they need to be able to trust the scientific evidence that we receive from a given field that's addressing a certain question. And in turn, policymakers need to trust the scientists who advises them on the basis of the scientific evidence. And in a bigger picture, society needs to trust the policymakers for the country to function well. Otherwise, things may go a bit pear-shaped. And I'm sure you can think of many more examples in this direction. There's a risk, though. This trust is undermined by unrealistic expectations. For example, if citizens and policymakers expect science to have always the answers, to basically speak with one voice and provide absolute certainties, the one and true answer. Or if politicians appeal to following the science to evade their responsibilities, for example, to just push on the responsibility to those scientists who have the answer to absolutely everything in theory. Well, but the scientists, as we know that scientific knowledge is tentative, and we have to acknowledge these limitations, and we have to communicate those. We have to acknowledge the independence of politics and build mutually trusted and respectful relationship with the politicians. Transparency and communication. We heard a lot about clear communication. And as a scientist and member of the group of chief scientific advisors to the European Commission and chair of that group, building trust is key, not only within the group, but also, of course, to the politicians and also the scientists that we work with who gather evidence for our scientific advice. Communicating findings and scientific evidence in a clear and accessible manner is one of the most important tools that helps us to build trust. So we need to specifically say what we know, what we don't know, what's uncertain, and also what is unknowable. Some questions can just not be answered. We need to communicate about risks and uncertainty without undermining trust in science advice. And that's difficult, but it can be done. And a very good example I'd like to present today, it's the work by Sam on microplastics. And I think later there's also a workshop including Bart Coleman, Sabine Pahl, which is also later discussed here in this session. We must be transparent and open in explaining how we analyze scientific evidence and develop policy options and recommendations. So the importance of science communication is good science communication, and it can help to a lot in this by educating people about scientific processes and its self-corrective nature, and by explaining areas of uncertainty by keeping science in the public discourse. So communication, communication, communication. Now, look at COVID, as we have heard and we have experienced, COVID has increased the profile of science advice. Something has also become clear. When you look at science advice, there are different types of science advice. You need science advice in emergency cases, or maybe longer term, that's strategic science advice. And you see here two balances. And when we go back to these three questions about what is uncertain, what we know, what we don't know, these the balance shifts. So in emergency, we need to respond quickly, and we don't have time to search for scientific evidence at length and in detail and across the bench space of different subjects. So we have to come up with recommendations or decisions that are built on some uncertainties that we cannot erase. And often we just don't know the answers. So some decisions may be taken without knowing the answer and just hoping for the best. On the other hand, strategic advice has a lot more time to develop what we know, and has then that balance shifts in that direction and becomes less uncertain. So with COVID, we had this scenario where most probably Europeans by now are able to name one or two virologists or epidemiologists. And unlike before the pandemic, scientists were perhaps not as prominently in the public. And on the one hand, that's great. On the other hand, it's an issue. It's an issue that it puts high-profile people on the spot to give advice for everything, whereas they cannot be experts for everything, and no matter how good they are or how good their intentions are. And therefore, we need to be quite careful with putting scientists on the spot. They are absolutely essential, but we can't rest our questions on the shoulders of one or two people who are out in the media. We need to consider different types or mechanisms and principles of science advice. And there are actually quite a few. There's the chief science advisors, the advisory councils, academies of sciences, scientific agencies, and they each operate differently and have their strengths and weaknesses. So we need to differentiate, and we need to be aware that there is no one mechanism that fits all. So for short-term emergency response, you need one approach, and for longer-term strategic response, you need yet another. However, the key principles of solid scientific advice that all mechanisms have in common is defined by these three questions, which I mentioned: what we know, what we don't know, what we're not sure about, and what just cannot be known. And to provide answers, experts are important, but experts have to be from a wide background. They need to be interdisciplinary for the response to be solid. And the solid response based on scientific evidence, we need diversity in the broadest sense, not only subject-wise, but also experience-wise. And bringing in the younger generations who have new ways of communicating as well will keep us on our toes instead of falling back into the old patterns of pre-pandemic. But just some insight on how the group of chief scientific advisors work. It's the scientific advice mechanism consisting of three elements. It's basically the SAPEA. SAPEA is the Science Advice for Policy by European Academies. It's a consortium consisting of over 100 European academies. Antonio Lopeno is here today, ALLEA, who's currently chairing SAPEA. Then there's a group of chief scientific advisors, of which I'm the chair, and there are 6 colleagues who I will present a little bit later. And then we're supported by the Secretariat at the European Commission, which quite a strong link, or helps us to link the work and helps us produce the scientific advice. The scientific advice for well-informed policy and data regulation has to be transparent and as free as possible from bias. That's absolutely key. And it has to be complementary to other scientific advice bodies in and beyond the European institutions. And that also partly refers to the, for example, emergency advice versus the longer term strategic advice. The principle of the scientific integrity and transparency of the group of chief scientific advisors, well, the members, of which there are 7, are selected with the help of an identification committee that's composed of an independent group of experts. We are contractually bound to be impartial, so we must not be partial, and appointed for 5 years. And this group selects its own chair. I was elected in November last year, following chairmanship of Rolf Hoyer. And the members must inform the chair if there's any conflict of interest when we work on a specific topic. It's important that we act on our personal capacity and that we're independent from any institutional or political interests. The process itself is reasonably complex, as you can see here on the slide, yet it's straightforward, and it makes sure that it's transparent and objective. So when we're facing societal challenges, or policy is facing societal challenges, questions come up, for example, the Green Deal or the Health Union, or now in the pandemic crisis. And there's a request from the Commission to the group of chief scientific advisors, and in collaboration with a group of chief scientific advisors, we define a so-called scoping paper, which sets out the scientific or the policy questions that needs to be answered. On that basis, then SAPEA gets drawn into the game, where experts in respective fields or complementary fields, spanning across the physical and the social and humanities, social sciences and humanities, bring in their expertise and produce an evidence review report. We may also gather evidence from other sources, but that relationship between SAPEA and the group of chief scientific advisors is close, yet we're working independently, and that's quite important to remain impartial. On the basis of the scientific evidence, we then develop the scientific advice, which is scrutinized by expert hearing. We expose it also, our recommendations, to stakeholders, and last but not least, we produce our scientific opinion, which is then handed over to the Commission. And these are proposals then for the policy or legislation, with the ultimate goal of having better policy making and legislation. So we're hoping that we're communicating our recommendations well, clearly and transparently in a manner that is useful for the policymakers. Therefore, science communication in action is critical. This is us. This is the group of chief scientific advisors as of May 2021. There was a little bit of a changeover after 5 years. And you can see that we have a broad spectrum of subjects, of course, not covering all. We have biochemistry, we have biology, geography, energy economics, history, biorobotics, chemistry, myself. It covers a broad range, but not everything, and which is a weakness and a strength. You could interpret it in both ways. We are experts in some ways, but we're not too close an expert to be biased, but we're able to understand scientific evidence that is provided. So this is us, and on the next slide you will see a series of scientific opinions that have been published since the group was established in 2015. And you can see here it ranges from cybersecurity, also a scientific opinion on how to give scientific advice. Specifically, it is looking at scientific advice in crisis. Then we also have other opinions where one builds on top of the other. For example, the group was working on food from the oceans, and during this research or work, it became evident that the oceans are actually full of plastics, which triggered a scientific opinion on microplastic pollution, which we conducted in collaboration with the chief scientific advisors of Canada, Mona Nehmer. And this in turn triggered a request from the Commission for us to work on microplastics pollution. And later on, there's this workshop that I referred to earlier. So it's actually, sorry, biodegradable plastics are my mistake. So these are links. The food from the ocean, microplastics pollution, and the last one triggered biodegradable plastics in the open environment. So you can see how these scientific opinions inform each other and how they trigger further questions and maybe requests for advice. And on that note, I'd like to thank you, but I'd like to highlight that in times of crisis, trust is even more important. And it's even more important to collaborate, connect with others across the subjects and range of experience. And we must communicate well and transparently And this applies to all areas of life, including science advice. So as I'm concluding here, I'm thinking of Mike's presentation earlier, and I'm thinking maybe we should stick our heads together and have a chat on how practitioners could benefit from communication research in a better way to transfer knowledge to policymakers in the best possible way. And in Europe, we have great diversity of such mechanisms due to different political cultures and institutional histories. And we need mutual understanding and better connection, but we need to remember no one size fits all approach. And we need better connected science advice. We need a better connected science advice ecosystem in Europe that brings together advisors from across thematic areas and from different countries. So let's team up. Thank you for your attention.